Hello, this is Jenny Heater from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Welcome to Module 5 of the Cities and Counties Solar PV Training Program, Deciding on a Financing Approach and Beginning PV Procurement. So far, we've covered setting a goal, identifying and screening sites, steps to a detailed site evaluation, and project financing policies and incentives. We have also hosted additional webinars on resiliency and NREL system advisory model. If you want to review these webinars, they are available in Litmos. In this module, we will help you decide on a financial model and understand how to move forward with procurement. By the end of this module, we hope that your city or county will be able to decide whether direct ownership, third-party ownership, or an energy performance contract is the best option for your city or county. We also hope that you'll understand the next steps in PV procurement depending on which method you select. In this module, we'll walk through multiple financing options and their associated procurement processes. We'll conclude with procurement lessons for local governments and a list of resources. The public sector, which includes local governments, typically relies on third-party ownership to install PV. GTM research estimated that about 70% of public sector PV was installed via a third-party ownership structure. As you learned in the last module, public sector entities are tax-exempt, which means that they cannot capture the investment tax credit, or ITC, directly. In 2018, the ITC provides a tax credit of 30% of the project cost. This phases down to 10% of the project's cost in 2022. GTM expects that when the ITC is only providing 10% of the project cost, public sector entities may rely less on third-party owned systems. The first option we'll review is direct ownership. It's important to note that direct ownership of PV is often used when grant or other funding can bring down the cost of the system. Under direct ownership, the PV project is government-owned. Your city typically would hire an engineering, procurement, and construction contractor, or EPC contractor, to develop the project. You may also consider a separate contract for operations and maintenance if you don't want to take this on yourself. Cities may not have the cash to purchase the system outright. Cities can fund their PV system via internal or external funding sources. For external funding sources, cities must have available borrowing capacity. To obtain external funding, credit rating is important as it will impact the interest you pay. Consult your city advisor and/or bond counsel as needed. Local governments may also wish to include solar in an upcoming planned bond, for example, for a new facility. By including solar in a bond with other project, administrative costs can be reduced. The Peralta Community College District in California used a general obligation bond, or GO bond, for their solar power installation at Laney College. Their GO bond monies could be used for capital improvement projects, for example, construction and renovation. Savings from the solar will go back into the general fund and can support non-capital expenditures. This allows them more flexibility in how they spend their funds. To the right, you'll see a photo of their system. It's a 231 kilowatt solar array installed on a baseball field house and the adjacent parking lot. Another example of a direct ownership project is in the city of Hutchinson, Minnesota. In this case, the city was able to own the PV system using a high percentage of grant funds to reduce the purchase price. The city received grant funds from their utility, Xcel Energy, that covered 3/4 of the cost. The city covered the remaining amount. Ultimately, the city installed a 400 kilowatt system on a closed landfill. The PV system will be directly connected to the city's wastewater treatment plant. The procurement pathway for direct ownership can vary depending on how the project will be funded or financed. Once that piece is figured out, the first step is to issue an RFP for an EPC contractor. The EPC contractor will be responsible for building the solar array. Your city could also consider hiring an O&M contractor. Once the RFP responses have been received, the city can evaluate responses, sign contracts, and the EPC contractor can commence construction. Once the array is operational, either the city or the O&M contractor will be responsible for ensuring the system is properly maintained. Municipal leases are known by many terms, which can be confusing. You may also hear the terms tax-exempt lease, since municipalities are tax-exempt, or tax-exempt lease purchase, since these deals, particularly for solar, are usually structured as a lease purchase. That is, the city will purchase the array at the end of the lease term. Municipal leases are another way for cities to own PV, by leasing the system and owning it at the end of that lease term. It's an alternative to traditional debt financing. One of the advantages of a municipal lease is that interest rates are typically lower due to the fact that the interest is tax exempt. Something to be aware of is that if you do sign an O&M agreement, carefully review it to ensure it does not prevent the interest from being tax exempt. Cities may find that municipal leasing is a faster process than issuing new debt. This is particularly true if a city has experience with municipal leasing, whether it has been for fleet vehicles or other equipment. Cities may prefer a municipal lease because it's not considered debt for state purposes. This means that your city should not need voter approval and that the agreement will not be counted as debt on the city's balance sheet. While the process is fairly quick compared to issuing debt, for smaller projects, a municipal lease may not make sense. Typically, financiers like to see a minimum size of more than 500 kilowatts. I'll now turn our presentation over to Chandra Shah, Senior Project Leader at NREL.
Hi, this is Chandra. I am going to cover Power Purchase Agreements, or PPAs. PPAs involve third-party ownership of the PV array, and this is a very popular method for implementing PV, as Jenny mentioned and shown in the GTM research. Under a PPA, the solar developer purchases, installs, owns, operates, and maintains the PV project for the life of the contract. So one of the key benefits of a PPA is that the developer can likely take advantage of federal and/or other tax incentives. For example, on the federal side, there is the investment tax credit and accelerated depreciation. At the state and local side, there could be solar sales tax or property tax exemptions. Another benefit is that in some markets it makes sense to sell the solar renewable energy certificates, or SRECs. In certain markets, these SRECs are very valuable. For example, in DC, the current market price is $380 per megawatt hour. In Massachusetts, it's approximately $300 per megawatt hour. And in New Jersey, it's $230 per megawatt hour. The tax incentives and SREC sales result in a lower PPA price for the city. Then the city will simply host the PV project and then purchase the electricity for the life of the contract. PPAs are typically the best option for large PV systems, typically greater than 500 kilowatts. This is just a rough rule of thumb. It may be possible to aggregate a number of sites to get to a larger project also. In that case, it's beneficial to ensure that the sites are relatively close together to keep the O&M costs down. Another concern with PPAs is to make sure that they are legal in your state and that you have an authority to do a PPA within your city. Keep in mind that PPAs involve a long-term contract, typically around 20 years. In certain markets, it may be possible to do a shorter-term contract if utility rates are very high and/or if there are attractive incentives. So here is an example of a PPA that was implemented by Washington, D.C.'s Department of General Services, or DGS. They implemented approximately 11 megawatts of solar through aggregating 40 properties, and this resulted in a 20-year PPA with WGL Energy. They used a wide range of properties in the PPA, including schools, hospitals, recreation centers, and their police training academy. As I mentioned, DC SREC prices are very high right now, and this helped to make the PPA very attractive to DGS. They're expecting to save approximately $25 million in electricity costs over the life of the PPA. They did have separate rates for rooftop and carport solar projects since the costs of these types of projects are different. As you can imagine, it can be complicated to manage 40 different properties. Sol Systems took on this management as a subcontractor to the PPA, and they were able to complete the project in approximately 18 months. Should you decide to implement a PPA, here is the procurement pathway to follow. First, you develop and issue an RFP for developers that offer the PPA option. Then you receive and evaluate the responses, negotiate and sign the contract, and then you can begin construction. Now I will cover Energy Savings Performance Contracts, or ESPCs. This is another method to implement solar at your site. ESPCs are also known by other names such as Performance Contracting, Energy Solutions Performance Contracting, Energy Service Company, or ESCO project. In this presentation, we are using the term ESPC. So with an ESPC, this involves a public-private partnership with an ESCO to implement a variety of energy measures. Typically, energy efficiency and energy management are included in ESPCs, but it also makes sense to consider renewables and PV. One key difference between a ESPC and direct ownership is that there's a guaranteed savings requirement for ESPC, and measurement and verification is used on an annual basis to ensure that guaranteed savings is met. Check the applicable ESPC authority for details on the guaranteed savings requirement and the M&V requirements. So if you decide to include PV in an ESPC, the PV could either be a standalone measure or you can bundle it with other measures. The PV can either be government-owned or third-party owned. If it's government-owned, keep in mind that the tax incentives will not be monetized and it may be difficult for the government to sell the SRECs. If it's third-party owned, then this would be like a PPA, and you need to make sure that the PPA model is allowable under the applicable state law. Keep in mind that ESCOs typically want large projects in the order of $1 to $1.5 million, so ensure that your total project size will be in that range at a minimum. The graph here shows the cash flows for an ESPC. Before an ESPC, you simply pay your utility costs. During an ESPC, you pay your utility costs at a reduced amount, and then you use the savings to make the ESPC payments. There might be a slight amount of savings that remain for the life of the ESPC contract. After the contract is done, the city can enjoy all of the savings. So the ability for a city to enter into an ESPC is governed by state laws. Every state has an ESPC regulation. This state regulation may be further refined by local laws or regulations. It's very important to review your ESPC state law and applicable regulations very carefully. Some of the considerations include what is the maximum allowable term. Typically, this will be in the range of 15 to 20 years. It could be slightly shorter or longer in certain states, and in some states it might be based on other criteria, such as the typical equipment life. Another important consideration is what type of measures are eligible, and then also whether measures can be bundled with shorter payback items, such as lighting, bundled with longer payback items, such as air conditioning. It's also important to understand what financing options are allowable. It's also important to look at the savings requirement details. You can look at the minimum required savings, and in some cases you may decide to have more stringent requirements. It's also important to understand what budget categories you can use to make the financing payments, as certain budget categories may not be allowed to use for the ESPC payments. And finally, you want to look at any requirements regarding how the procurement must be conducted, or if there are any suggested guidelines for how the procurement must be conducted. There also may be available resources that impact how you want to conduct your procurement. It's very important to contact your city attorney to interpret the law and regulation. Keep in mind that interpretations could vary, so contact the city attorney that will be approving your project. So ESPCs are going to require some type of financing source. You may be able to use internal funds, or in some cases you will want to pursue external funds. Jenny mentioned some of the funding sources that might be allowed. The preferable option depends upon what is allowable under the ESPC regulation and other applicable regulations, and on local market conditions. So contact your finance and budget department staff and get their input on what options are available and what best option to pursue. In some cases, the ESCO may assist with financing, providing information about the sources that might be available, and in limited cases may actually provide financing. Keep in mind, though, that cities typically have lower cost financing options available, so it may be beneficial or preferable to have the city obtain the financing to keep costs down. Should you decide to pursue an ESPC, this is the approach to take. First, determine whether your ESPC will involve only PV or PV and efficiency measures. Then decide whether the PV will be owned by the government or third-party owned. Then develop and issue an RFP to the ESCO community, receive and evaluate the responses, select an ESCO. The ESCO typically conducts an energy audit and then develops a proposal. So you will evaluate the proposal, and then if you decide to move forward, arrange for the project financing, sign the contract with the ESCO, and then the ESCO will develop the project. And once the project is operating, you will measure and verify the savings every year. So here is an example of an energy savings performance contract. The city of Lowell, Massachusetts signed a contract with Ameresco, and this ESPC contract included energy efficiency, energy management, as well as PV. The total agreement was over $20 million with $1.5 million in annual savings. The PV total size was almost 2 megawatts with 3 rooftop systems at schools and then a larger 1.5 megawatt system on a landfill. The city is paying a discounted electricity rate for the electricity from these PV systems. So now we've covered the most common methods for implementing PV, and here is a quick reference guide that you can use to help you decide which option to pursue. If you have access to cash or low-interest debt, or you have grant dollars, then you might want to pursue direct ownership. However, if you have little or no upfront capital and your project is large, then you might want to pursue a PPA. A PPA is also beneficial if you want to aggregate a number of smaller sites so that you have a fairly large project in aggregate. And finally, if you are planning to do some energy efficiency measures and your PV project is going to be small, then ESPC may be the best approach to take. So now I will cover some other options for implementing PV. The method by which local governments implement solar is not always a clear choice. There are some business models that blend elements of the different options. These hybrid approaches, for example, for direct ownership might involve different types of financing sources. For example, they could include grants, bonds, and then other sources of financing. Grant funding could also be used to buy down the cost of a PPA or an ESPC, and as I mentioned, a PPA could be included within an ESPC. Another possibility is to partner with your utility. Some cities have municipal utilities, and they could consider unique contracting arrangements. If your city is served by an investor-owned utility, there still may be an opportunity to partner with that utility, but keep in mind that regulatory approval is likely to be required, and that's going to increase the time that it takes to get your project approved and implemented. And then finally, you might want to consider community solar. Some utilities do have these new programs that allow for more than one customer to purchase a share of a PV project. If this is the case, then the city may want to host a project for the utility's community solar program, or they might want to buy shares in a community solar project. If you decide to pursue community solar, make sure that you investigate the program structure carefully and understand criteria such as how the SRECs are treated.
Before issuing an RFP, the first step is to make sure you understand all of the financing options in your area and have determined what is allowable. Hopefully our resources have helped you in this regard. You'll still want to work with key city staff, such as your city attorney and finance and budget staff. These individuals can help you understand and meet any applicable regulations. You may also have a state energy office that can offer expertise in solar procurement and/or financing. For example, the Colorado Energy Office has an ESPC program for local governments. In June, we'll be releasing a template RFP that cities and counties can use for their PV procurement. There are also PPA and ESPC templates available from other organizations. The link to those resources are at the end of this module. In this section, we review some regulatory and contracting issues that can occur when local governments are financing or owning PV systems. First, for long-term contracts, such as a PPA or a lease, payments typically require the use of appropriated funds. Thus, if the funds are not appropriated, the local government would not be able to make payments. This creates a risk to the PV developer. However, there are ways to mitigate this risk. For example, the first thing to do is highlight that the risk exists. Second, provide steps that both parties will take to minimize the risk. And third, provide remedies available to the developer should a non-appropriation event occur. Solar developers have been able to overcome the risks associated with non-appropriation by negotiating in good faith with the hosts and agreeing to mutually acceptable contract terms. Another issue to consider is voter approval. While long-term contracts may be subject to appropriation risks, they typically aren't considered public debt requiring voter approval. As a result, the developer can obtain financing, and the municipality can avoid the cost and uncertainty associated with seeking voter approval. Conversely, if governments do wish to issue general obligation bonds, they typically need to seek voter approval, or have previously approved bonding authority in place to do so. And while voter approval typically resolves the appropriations issue, there is no guarantee that voters will approve the bond that includes the funding for the solar project. One final issue to consider is contract terms and contract length. Depending on the local jurisdiction, restrictions may exist on the maximum length of contracts allowed when contracting for various types of services, including energy-related services. There may be legal limitations with respect to the ability of currently elected officials to enter into contracts that create binding obligations for future elected officials. As a result, it's important to ensure that when considering a PPA, an ESPC, or other long-term contract, what maximum contract length is allowable. NREL has worked with numerous organizations, including state, local, and federal governments, to support the solar RFP process. Based on this experience, as well as examples from recent local government-issued PV RFPs, we'll be providing a solar template RFP in June. This template will cover owned systems as well as third-party systems. From our experience, we've found that RFPs function best when they include using standard metrics, provide site-specific information, and are precise when necessary. By requiring respondents to provide responses in standard metrics, proposals can be compared fairly against one another. For example, require respondents to estimate performance of a system using NREL's PV Watts or System Advisor model. Another component is making sure you provide sufficient site information. Developers will need to know where you're planning to install, as well as how many square feet or acres approximately are available for PV. Many cities choose to provide aerial maps of their sites outlining the areas available. Finally, be precise where necessary. For example, if you know the city will require a 6-foot security fence around the installation, write that into the RFP. Instead of saying something general about providing fencing, note that it must be a 6-foot tall security fence surrounding the installation. Each city or county may have its own criteria or weighting priorities. One example includes 4 elements, each with its own weighting criteria. Typically, the cost-effectiveness of the proposal is the most heavily weighted component. This is because cities want to ensure that they are getting the least cost proposal. But it's also important to consider things like the project team experience and approach. This is because without a qualified project team, the project may not ultimately be developed. Now that we've covered PV financing and procurement, we hope you're ready to move forward with your PV system or systems. We have some additional resources available in the following slides. Tune into our office hours session on June 7th, 1 to 2 Eastern, to ask your questions on this module.